okay. Absolutely amazing. Look at that. Absolute seamless clockwork there. We have recording on. Got it. So good afternoon all. Thank you for attending today's Ecology and Biodiversity Net Gain update. And thank you to the Pipeline Industry Guild for hosting another great webinar. Before I introduce our two presenters today, a couple of housekeeping items. As I've probably said to a lot of you now already, we are recording this session, which will be posted on the Guild's YouTube channel. So please remain muted throughout and keep cameras off. The presentation will be led by Claire today. Will be followed by an audience sort of Q&A session at the end. Can I ask you all to please post your questions in the chat function at either at the top or bottom of your page. Everyone will be able to see them. If you don't have your name assigned to yourself, please put your name and company in there. That would be great. It will help us to answer any questions post if we don't get through all the questions today. Please ask as many questions as you want. Claire will probably kill me for this afterwards, and Alison, but please don't let them off lightly. As many questions as you can would be absolutely brilliant. We want to make it as interactive as possible at the end and make this a real worthwhile session for you all. So that just leaves me with the pleasure of introducing my two colleagues and our presenters today. Firstly, Alison Pritchard, head of our environmental planning team here at Dalcour Maclaren. Alison joined DM in 2019. Feels like I've known her a lot longer than that. It's been a great few years. She has almost 30 years experience in planning, EIA, land development and project management in the utilities and property sectors. She's delivered a wide range of challenging projects covering both sensitive greenfield sites and European ecology and UK nationally significant archaeological designations. She's also managed brownfield sites with difficult technical constraints and will hopefully bring a practical view to the update this afternoon. Claire Pooley is our lead ecologist, has been with us now for just over 12 months. She has worked with a variety of clients in a wide range of sectors, including utilities, power and renewables, wastewater, residential, business, rail and highways. She has significant experience working with Welsh Water, including overseeing delivery of ecology input into capital projects, and undertook a secondment with the Capital Delivery Alliance there. Also, Claire has worked with Natural Resources Wales, leading on ecology input into flood protection and fish passage improvement schemes. So are both extremely well qualified to give you the update this morning or this afternoon. So I will hand over to Claire now. I am operating the slides, so please shout at me if it don't come through on your screen well, and I will also turn my camera off.
Thanks, Sam. So we're talking about biodiversity net gain today. Just to quickly run through the agenda so you know what to expect. I'm going to start off talking about the status of biodiversity in the UK, just to give some context to discussions about net gain, and then briefly go over some legislation and policy that currently exists and relates to that, and talk a bit about organisations and authorities that are already very much working with net gain. Prior to forthcoming legislation in England particularly, and then just about the best practice principles really when considering net gain and the benefits that will bring to you in project management. Also a bit more detail then about the Environment Bill and the associated Defra Metric, and a discussion about how really you can sort of get around the challenges of that with some potential ideas for kind of avoidance and mitigation before sort of going on to a few points about how we could potentially support biodiversity net gain in projects. So to start with, what is biodiversity net gain? So it might be something that you're familiar with as an approach, or not particularly, but you've heard it being referred to, particularly more recently in projects. So it's defined here by Defra as an approach to development that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than before. With measurably being a key word there. So it's a specific measurable outcome of project activities to deliver demonstrable and quantifiable benefits to biodiversity compared to the baseline situation. So biodiversity, as many of you probably will know, is in a crisis and has suffered significant declines, not just in distribution, but also abundance. And this has been shown by the recent State of Nature report, which is produced fairly regularly in the UK by a number of charities and nature conservation organisations who look at statistics of various species across the UK. So a couple of alarming statistics here: 15% of species are threatened with extinction in the UK, and 133 of those assessed have already become extinct. And also, I mean, the total number of breeding birds fell by 44 million between 1967 and 2009. So yeah, quite shocking, really. And these declines and changes in distribution are caused by a number of factors. One of the key ones, which was also reported in this report, was changing agricultural management, but also a number of other factors, such as the introduction of invasive species and climate change, development, poor management, and also fisheries. But despite these apparent problems, the expenditure on biodiversity has fallen significantly as well, quite recently. So why is this a problem? Well, essentially, biodiversity provides us with a range of goods and services. So some of those are more tangible than others. So things like food and water and fuel. But there are other services which you might not be aware of, such as the recreational value, but also things like flood regulation and carbon sequestration. So all really important, and all these goods and services which are provided by biodiversity underpin our well-being, health, economy, and our culture. The recent Descriptor review, which was basically looking at the economics of biodiversity, had some interesting findings, and maybe not that surprising to most ecologists, that we are failing to engage with nature sustainably. Our demands are exceeding the capacity for ecosystem goods and services to support us. And essentially that economies need to embed biodiversity and we need to account for it rather than it being something additional that's not necessarily considered. So we have a number of existing legislations and policies which protect biodiversity, and this includes sites, habitats, and species. Some of these you'll probably be familiar with, like the Wildlife and Countryside Act, the Habitat Regulations, and the NERC Act. And some of these also have requirements for net gain already. So the NERC Act does have the requirement to, where possible, enhance biodiversity. And this is the same in national planning policy and local development plans, which I'll talk about a bit in the minute. And also in Wales, the Environment Wales Act does now require net gain to be delivered in planning, but there isn't a specific target. So in terms of national planning policy, net gain is a requirement in all of the various developed countries. I mean, specifically for England, the National Planning Policy Framework 2021 states planning policy and decisions should contribute to and enhance the natural and local environment by minimizing impacts on and providing net gains for biodiversity, including by establishing coherent ecological networks that are more resilient to current and future pressures. So B&G is already something that's being considered because of this requirement in planning and being in many local development plans. And many councils and district authorities and organisations have already adopted biodiversity net gain targets. And this is regardless of the forthcoming legislation, which I'll talk about a bit later, the Environment Bill. But just, you know, wanting to implement net gain as good practice and, you know, follow the existing policies that are in place. Some of these organisations that we already work with and we're aware have net gain targets include Severn Trent Water. So they have a 15% biodiversity net gain capital programme requirement. That's where you need to do a preliminary ecological appraisal. So you've got an impact on biodiversity in the first place. Also, the Environment Agency, there's a 20% biodiversity net gain requirement across the Midlands Hub Sustainability Plan and Collaborative Delivery Framework. And then Anglian Water also have set a target to achieve a 10% net gain from a 2019 baseline. And we've been working with the Environment Agency recently. They obviously have their targets and we're supporting them not just with preliminary ecological appraisals, but expanding that to consider biodiversity net gain and looking at baseline calculations and post-development calculations. And offering them advice on what they can do to achieve that. So as I mentioned before, there's a number of sort of good practice principles. And I mean, these are actually set out in a guidance document called Biodiversity Net Gain Good Practice Principles for Development, which has been produced by a number of organisations and is a really useful guidance document for developers and project managers, as well as ecologists, to use to understand what you need to do to consider biodiversity net gain, not just the sort of Environment Bill requirements, but the general concepts. So a key one is the mitigation hierarchy. And this is really important, not just because it protects biodiversity, but it also can help a project make efficiencies. So by starting off and looking at what biodiversity you've got and how you can avoid it, you can obviously make you know, time and cost savings within a project. But according to the hierarchy, that should always be the first step. The second step should then be, where that's not possible, to look at how you can minimise the impact on biodiversity. So looking to amend the design or construction methods to do this might be timing or the layout of the development. And then the next step would be, only if that's not possible, or you still have some potential impacts on biodiversity within the site, what can you do to remediate that within the site? So re-establish habitats and things like that. And only then would you be looking to offset any residual impacts that you can't mitigate on site, and that might include off-site habitat creation. And that's essentially mitigation hierarchy. Biodiversity net gain is something that's done on top of this. So these steps need to be followed, but then you need to consider biodiversity net gain. So there are actually 10 principles, but I have just sort of summarized them here and expanded on a few of them. One of the key points really is to consider biodiversity net gain early on, as early as possible in a project, and within all the stages. So it's not just at the beginning where you're looking at the baseline, how can you avoid impacts, or what do you need to do to mitigate? But during the optioneering, you might want to look at those different options and which one has the better impact, and how you can create or provide a net gain for those different options. Another really key one actually is avoiding the loss of biodiversity that can't be offset elsewhere. So that includes irreplaceable habitats, and you might be familiar with those. That's going to include habitats like peatland or ancient woodland. In terms of biodiversity net gain, it also excludes statutory protected sites. So if you have a SSSI, you couldn't be looking to develop that and deliver net gain. And then involving stakeholders, really essential to get local inputs and engagement with your project from those key stakeholders. Finding out perhaps from the local authority what their policies are, and then in sort of creating a plan for net gain, having their input into that as well. And then addressing risk and allowing for contingency. So in terms of habitat creation for net gain, there might be risks associated with elements of that in terms of it not being well-established methods, or there might be quite a significant period of time that's needed to create them. So you need to have a contingency plan to really allow for that and ensure that those habitats are created as they should be. Always use robust, credible evidence. So this will essentially be, your baseline data, which you'll be gathering at the beginning of the project, including, your phase 1 habitat survey, which will tell you what you've got. And that will be required not just on the habitats affected, but obviously areas where you're proposing to create habitats. Also contributing towards nature conservation priorities at a local, regional and national level. So that will be something that's informed by local plans, biodiversity action plans, or green infrastructure strategies. And again, that your stakeholders will be able to engage with. Also think about contributing towards and enhancing existing ecological networks. So think about the location of habitat creation, and really try and kind of create the best habitat that you can. And think about sustainability. Don't just create a habitat for biodiversity. If you're creating, say, a woodland, think about other the benefits that will have, like flooding regulation, and try and sort of meet other sustainability targets that you might have. And lastly, be additional. So as I mentioned before, net gain is additional to mitigation and compensation, and that needs to be demonstrated. I've put a point there, sorry, Sam, just to go back quickly about engaging an ecologist. I think that is, really essential for understanding what you've got on site in the first stages of a project, and then, having the ecologist to advise you on what the impacts are going to be and what your biodiversity net gain requirements are. So, regardless of planning policy and legislation, there are numerous benefits to considering biodiversity net gain, and this includes obviously the benefit that will have to your reputation, and also how that will enable you to be more competitive when you're tendering for work, or particularly for clients that have their own targets for biodiversity net gain. Improving relationships with stakeholders, particularly local authorities and statutory nature conservation organisations. Obviously, just demonstrating you are working in accordance with policy, legislation and best practice. And as I've mentioned before, demonstrating that you are also achieving sustainability commitments. And creating sites with high biodiversity can also enhance well-being of local communities. So that's another factor that you can, really market as part of your projects. And also, I think I've said about sort of saving money and time in terms of trying to avoid impacts, but by considering net gain and understanding what it requires early on in the project, you can really kind of engage with the process, and rather than leave it to later on and find that it's kind of putting a stop on the progress. It can be efficient to kind of consider it. So the Environment Bill, I've mentioned briefly. So it's going to become legislation. I'll just discuss the timeline a bit later on, but essentially it's to improve the environment, but it includes requirements for biodiversity net gain. This specifically is a 10% mandatory net gain requirement for planning applications. But there are a number of other elements. The biodiversity net gain sites will be registered. These sites will need to be maintained for 30 years. There are also conservation covenants, and local nature reserve strategies will be established. So, as I mentioned, it's in its final stages, and basically we'll be obtaining Royal Ascent soon, but the proposed sort of programme was to do that at the end of this year, and it looks like it's probably going to be pushed back into next year, I would imagine, but it is happening. So it will be important to prepare for biodiversity net gain in projects where planning is required. So the Defra Metric is essentially an accounting tool, and this is something that's going to be required to demonstrate biodiversity net gain as part of the Environment Bill. So just to run through what that involves, we basically have sort of two calculations, and the metric then works out what your uplift in biodiversity units is. So to start off with, you look at what you've got on the site prior to development, and you establish the size of your habitats, and multiply these by a number of factors, which is distinctiveness. And basically that's the sort of rarity of your habitat, and is a sort of auto-populated unit in the tool. Condition, that's something that you will have to establish from your habitat surveys. So we'll need an ecologist to determine for you. And then strategic location. So that's where your habitats are. Are they within an area important for ecological connectivity, and within areas described in local plans, including sort of green infrastructure strategies. So that will give you the overall pre-development units, and then you work out the post-development units in a similar way, but you also multiply that with a number of negative multipliers, including the difficulty to create habitat. So that's based on what type of habitat you're creating, the time taken to create that, and then the distance from site. So this table just demonstrates what you'll be expected to do based on the type of habitats that you have. So they're organised in terms of how distinctive they are, and the rarest habitats will be very high or high, and essentially you can't change the distinctiveness in the habitats that you create, or the type of habitat, and the condition needs to be ideally improved. But as you go down in distinctiveness, that changes. So at the very low distinctive habitats, you do need to trade up in terms of distinctiveness, but it can be a different type of habitat that you create. Although, again, you need to look at improving the condition. So this will be detailed within the metric when you put in your baseline data, and is a useful indicator to inform habitat creation plans based on the various options that you have. There are pros and cons to the accounting tool, as well as generally biodiversity net gain, which we'll discuss later. But essentially, it is a really useful tool because everyone will be using it. It will be a common method for accounting, and it will be transparent to all stakeholders that are involved in the planning process, and will give you predictable outcomes. So, as I mentioned before, it's useful to use for different options to work out what you're likely to get in terms of biodiversity net gain. But obviously, it involves quite a lot of input. It takes time and requires a expert to be involved in that. And I've just added the point there that it is also just a proxy. So it's just an indication of enhancements based on habitats. So it also doesn't account for species. So the metric and biodiversity net gain counting should always be reported, and within that you need to describe everything that you've got on site and give it context. So for example, you might have a habitat that's not that valuable in itself, but it might support a rare species, and you need to therefore consider that and the enhancements that you would need to be doing for it, regardless of what the metric's telling you. So again, that just highlights really how you need ecology input really throughout the process. So you're probably thinking, wow, this sounds like it's going to be a challenge in projects, if not already. And some of the key things really that are, it does reduce the amount of land on site where you're looking at mitigation within the site. And there's, that's costly, but there's also the cost of the long-term management. or you may be looking at off-site habitat creation, and again, the same issues apply there, but you've also got landowner consent issues. The alternative is to look at purchasing credits, and again, that can be costly and not always clear on what you should be paying, so the prices can vary quite a lot. So something to think about, I mean, obviously try and avoid impacts in the first place. That will certainly save you a lot of time and money, or try and, you know, minimize them so that you don't have to deliver as much biodiversity net gain. But where it's needed and you have to create habitats, think about you know, nature-based solutions. I appreciate these aren't always possible, but where they can be integrated into a scheme, they do provide you with that habitat, obviously, as well as serving other engineering functions. It's a few examples here. We've got a swale in the top left corner, which is obviously attenuating surface water drainage, and you're creating a wetland habitat, but, you know, depending on the location, it can also provide you with some recreational or educational benefits. And then in the top right, we've got some woodland planting. So particularly where you've got large areas, that can be really useful in basically flood regulation, but then also, you know, again, providing benefits. You've got the species-rich woodland, but it might be used for recreation, and you've got yeah, carbon sequestration as well being delivered by the trees. The grassland there is actually a green roof, although you can't really see it properly. So that's something that can be incorporated into buildings and, you know, provides drainage in terms of surface water runoff, but then, you know, creates this you know, wildlife rich habitat, and is also really kind of you know, nice to look at, and, you know, can provide other sort of educational services. Reed bed planting in the last one there, so that's useful for water purification, but, you know, reed beds are a priority habitat and support a number of species, and they can also be useful for kind of educational purposes. So again, to help you think about where you're creating habitats, I think I've mentioned before, in terms of the principles, try and locate in areas where, you know, it's identified in local plans, or, you know, green infrastructure strategies. And I've mentioned here the local nature recovery strategies, and the nature recovery network. So the local nature recovery strategies will be basically published by local authorities further to the Environment Act, and they will be telling developers or project promoters to you know, locate habitat creation in key areas where you've got better connectivity, or they're you know, needed for certain species. So the metric will actually acknowledge this and give you more points. So that's why it's, you know, it's really useful to think about that as early on as possible as well. I think I mentioned before as well about conservation credits. So they can be purchased from a third party. So some local authorities are running schemes, but there are also you know, private businesses are setting up these environment banks, and, you know, they can essentially take the problem off your hands and deliver biodiversity net gain for you for a fee. But obviously that can be quite costly, as I mentioned before as well. But another alternative is, you might have a relationship with a landowner, or working with a consultancy that does, and you could look to create a really rich biodiversity site with a number of habitats that could actually offset more than one project that you're working on. So would be quite an efficient way of delivering biodiversity net gain. And you can also locate that ideally in places where they're optimum for delivering net gain, such as in the local nature reserve areas. So obviously I've mentioned ecology input. I think there's also support that can be provided in terms of identifying land for offsetting, and not to sell our services, but just to touch on areas that we can kind of support on. Obviously we can identify land that can be utilised for offsetting. And then also, gather information on your baseline in terms of what habitats are there, what condition they are, and undertake those calculations in terms of pre-development, as well as interpret local and national policy, and advise on the best options to reduce biodiversity net gain requirements. In addition to advising on the various options and what enhancements might be most appropriate. So that's the end. Thank you.
Well done, Claire. That was brilliant. Let me just source out the video and come back. That's brilliant. Thank you. We are. It's that good. You've covered so much there, Claire, that no one has any questions at the moment within the chat function. Hopefully they'll come through shortly. I think I'll kick off a question here, if that's all right. I have one question. Hopefully Alison might chip in and actually do something now and give you a break for 2 minutes. But so first of all, if you could provide one piece of advice to everyone on the call today, just very simply, what would it be? What would be the main takeaway from today?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I think my first degree is civil engineering, so I probably have a lot of sympathy with perhaps a few people out there thinking, oh no, more legislation, more hurdles we've got to jump, that kind of thing. And it can seem that way, that people are putting barriers in place to stop things being built and infrastructure we need. But I think it's not. It doesn't have to be bad, and I think this is good for the environment. But I think in terms of making sure people can build what they need to build and plan ahead, I think the key advice is planning. Not planning as in applying for planning, but preparation. When you're looking at your design, when you're looking for your linear scheme, when you're looking for your new site to develop, get that advice early from whoever you use. This is the DM pitch, because if you get that expert advice early on, then actually you can prevent some of the problems. You can make life difficult for yourself if you decide to try to perhaps pursue a site or a route that actually might not be the best and optimum one. So if you get that advice early, you can look at the potential difficulties that you might encounter, and you may have the ability to modify your design or route to make life a little bit easier for yourself. And even if you don't have that ability to be able to do that, at least realistically, the timescales and costs that you might be looking for. So it'll help you plan, program, and spend in a much more sort of relevant and realistic way.
That's good. Just playing devil's advocate here. Do you think the actual legislation will make a difference to the population of protected species? I know you talked about at the start, or the sort of the decline. Will it make a difference?
It should do, and the aim is to obviously provide habitat for species, and evidently what we're doing is not enough, and we already have protected species